Welcome to Vital Records, the monthly genealogy tip series.
Happy Women's History Month. This month's video is all about researching the ladies in your family tree. Although women have always led lives that deserve to be remembered, they've often been forgotten or overlooked in the historic record. Researching women is simply more difficult than researching men, and this is true for a variety of reasons. I'm going to discuss a few of those reasons today, as well as some tips and tricks for getting around them. Why exactly is it generally harder to research the women in your family tree? There are two big reasons that sum up the problem. First, naming traditions that help to separate a woman from her biological family after marriage, and fewer legal rights, which led to a lack of opportunities and representation in records. Let's start with naming traditions. In the US and much of Europe, women traditionally take on their husband's surname when they marry, and then they drop their maiden name. In fact, women were often simply referred to by their husband's name entirely, such as Mrs. John Smith. This can make it difficult to research women in general, let alone connect a woman to her parents. Depending on the time period, locating a woman's maiden name might be pretty easy, or it might be just about impossible. Some records that you can look at to provide a woman's maiden name include death certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, church records, social security applications, and probate records. Probate records are a pretty big category, and they can be the most time-intensive of these options. Whenever someone died who owned property, especially land, they left an estate that would need to be legally processed and distributed. This process created a lot of paperwork that might have listed your female ancestor by name in her father or grandfather's probate. If she was already married, her name could appear any number of ways, such as my daughter Rebecca, my children William, Robert, John, and Rebecca Smith, or my daughter Rebecca Smith, wife of Richard Smith. You also might see a list of folks who were receiving money from the estate. A group of people who all received the exact same amount were likely siblings, the children of the deceased. Look for the name of your female ancestor in these lists. Once you've found a name that matches that of your ancestor, you have a place to start looking for more proof that this is the correct person. You also might find hints to a woman's maiden name or links to her family members in the names of her children. Does she have a child with a strange first or middle name that might be a surname? It might be her maiden name. She also might have named her children after her parents, siblings, or grandparents. Familial naming patterns can give you clues, but there are a variety of naming pattern rules that might have been in use depending on your ancestor's heritage and the time period. Do some more research into this topic to see if it can be of help. Folks with Hispanic heritage generally don't have the same problem locating a woman's maiden name, as women usually did not change their surnames, and children were given the surnames of both of their parents. This makes it much easier to not only locate a woman's parents, but her mother's parents as well. As you explore your family tree, make sure to research the cultural traditions and laws in the countries of your ancestors to see how it might impact your research. A second reason that your female ancestor might be harder to track is that women have historically had few, if any, legal rights. In the US, women were often considered the property of their husband and were seen as just an extension of him rather than as their own individual person. Married women usually did not own any property. Their husbands were legally the owner of all of their possessions, from land and furniture to even the clothes that they wore. Consider this. It wasn't until 1974, with the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, that women in the US were legally entitled to open a bank account without the permission of a man. So if this was going on in the 1970s, you can imagine what life was like for the women in the 1800s and prior. Also, keep in mind that white women had more legal rights than women of color. Historically, many women of color, be they born in the US or having immigrated here, had fewer legal rights and may not have qualified for naturalized citizenship. It's astounding to consider that Native Americans were not considered US citizens until 1924. And a woman's citizenship was tied to her male relatives. So if a white female citizen married a man who did not qualify for citizenship, such as an immigrant from Asia, she actually lost her citizenship. This law wasn't overturned until 1922. Because women lacked rights under the law, their names appeared less often in legal records. Why record women when they weren't truly considered their own person? A great example of this is the U.S. Census prior to 1850. Only heads of household were recorded by name, and any other member of the household, be they children or adults, free or enslaved, were recorded only as tally marks. It wasn't until 1850 that white women were recorded by name, and until 1870 for formerly enslaved people. There are a few exceptions to this, however. One might have been in a woman's religious life, as some religions or denominations allowed for more participation. Take Quakers, for example, who allowed women to preach, and who recorded them by their own names in records. And Quakers created some great records. Look for church records to see if your female ancestors were recorded there by name. These might help you to connect her to her parents or other family members. Widows are another exception. After the death of her husband, a widow was able to own, or at least control until her death or remarriage, the property that her husband left behind. Many women actually chose to remain unmarried to maintain this legal independence. This independence will be reflected especially in tax records, where a woman's names are rare. She might be listed specifically as a widow, as an administrator of an estate, or a guardian of children. Aside from these exceptions, there are a few strategies to get around this lack of representation in records. As previously discussed, look for women in various vital records such as death certificates, marriage records, and obituaries, especially from the 1900s onward, and then probate records. For female immigrants, naturalization records can be very helpful, especially for those who arrived around the turn of the 20th century and onward. These records often list her parents and her birthplace, much like a birth certificate. The further back in time you go, the harder it will likely be, and will require more complicated research. Since women were considered an extension of their husband or father, research the men in their lives. Get to know every name that the men went by, full names, initials, and nicknames, and track down every record that applies to them. Their land deeds will show you where your female ancestor lived. Their estate index shows you the material goods that she had in her home. Their income or property value that was reflected on the census and tax records shows you the family's financial status and indicates her financial stability. City directories will show if she worked outside the home. While not every record will provide clues about her maiden name, every record you find is an insight into the life that she led. I hope that you'll take some time to focus on the women in your family tree this month and honor the lives that are often overlooked or forgotten. I also invite you to join us at the Hamilton Mill branch for our twice-a-month genealogy club. Check out the events calendar on our website for more information. Thanks for watching.